Hi, so I had a question about the different parameters that you get out of your nearest device and which ones to use or why they're important or why they're different. And so to talk about that, I think it's important to quickly review a little bit of the background of NIRS and how it works. So I'm going to put this chart up here, and this is the absorption spectra of hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin have chromophores, so kind of what the component that's responsible for the color of the molecule and how that molecule absorbs light. And what you can see is that there's actually a lot of similarities between oxy and deoxyhemoglobin. So if a hemoglobin has oxygen or doesn't have oxygen on it. But in a certain spectrum here, so kind of it's above the 600 nanometers to like 900 nanometers, you get the separation between the two molecules, which we use to our advantage and which lets NIRS distinguish between the two. So you get to see, well, this is an oxyhemoglobin and this is a deoxyhemoglobin. Now, the problem with this is generally NIRS is that it's hard to quantify. You can kind of identify that there's two different colors in play, but it's difficult to quantify how much it is. And my favorite way of visualizing this, to help people visualize this, is by taking this kind of collection of LEDs that you see here. And you have red LEDs and you have blue LEDs, which will represent the oxy and the deoxy. And here, in the picture, we can see that you can count the number of LEDs you have, so you can quantify the number of LEDs. And you can then make a ratio between the two. You can see there's X number of blue and X number of red LEDs. The problem with NIRS is that it's not this direct. Everything becomes blurry, like you see in the example that kind of this change, right? So it kind of blurs it all together. So you can see the two colors, right? Red and blue, so you can tell it's oxy and it's deoxy and they're separate, which is what NIRS does, but you can't really count the single LEDs anymore. But what you can do is kind of get an idea of the ratio between the two, right? Because you just have like an area. So I think that helps a lot of people kind of think about, well, why can't we quantify these values? Because this is kind of what we look at when you kind of look through skin and through different layers. The physical properties, photon path lengths, and complications that are hard to define, especially in these kind of in vivo settings. So this is what happens. So that's one of the problems. So generally, you then have these non-quantifiable values. They're just like often they're kind of arbitrary units, or they're kind of micromoles or something. And usually they are then oxy and deoxyhemoglobin, and I'm just going to go with the term arbitrary units. And you look at them, and usually then the importance is kind of this change that they go through. So if the values increase or decrease, it says something, and you don't really quantify them. And then people say, well, which of the two values, like, do I use oxyhemoglobin, do I use deoxyhemoglobin, what do I use? And there's literature about this you can go out and read, and generally I would say that the deoxyhem, so both values, the problem with both of them is that generally they're susceptible to changes in blood volume or blood flow. So these values are going to change if you change the amount of blood that's moving in or the amount of blood that's around, right, in the muscle. But because we don't know how much there is, it's hard to gauge what's going on with these volume changes. And so often, one of the things that they said is, well, what helps is that if you isolate the system, so you have to create an occlusion, you have no more blood volume changes, and now you should have a 1-to-1 ratio, right? If if you get one more oxyhemoglobin, it should be one less deoxyhemoglobin, and because they should play, right? You take oxygen off one hemoglobin, it becomes deoxy, and those ratios should be 1-to-1. And you see that in occlusions when you essentially get deoxy and oxy, you like the same rate of change like this. And put the picture up right here, you can kind of take a look at that. But if you open the system, this becomes really hard to gauge and really hard to figure out what's going on, because you don't know what's happening with this blood volume changes. And one of the concerns is, especially when you get peripheral blood volume changes that don't have anything to do with the muscle per se or the metabolism of the muscle. So if you get hot, you get thermoregulation, and you get blood in the tissue that isn't the muscles and the skin tissue. But if your NIRS device is just measuring all the tissue, got kind of homogeneous, that's going to affect. So all of a sudden you get this increase in blood volume that has nothing to do with the muscle per se. And generally what's accepted is that this affects oxyhemoglobin much more. So your oxyhemoglobin signal is going to be much more susceptible to like thermoregulatory blood volume changes. This makes sense because you get this blood going to the skin. Skin is not that metabolically active as the muscle, so it remains oxyhemoglobin because it's just circulating through. And then you get these kind of ink changes in oxyhemoglobin that aren't related to your muscle metabolism. For this reason, a lot of people choose to use the deoxyhemoglobin value. And the deoxyhemoglobin value is also much closer associated with papers with fractional O2 extraction, so kind of how much oxygen that you're taking off, kind of MVO2. So it's generally used more. Now, but it's still a susceptible value to changes in, because you don't know what's going on with all the blood flow, but it's more robust, so generally it's used more. Now, the other option that you have, which I think is the best way of doing it, is that you have to basically take your oxyhemoglobin and measure it to the relation of change of oxy and deoxy. And that is what would be like a saturation, right? Can you get oxyhemoglobin over total hemoglobin, you get a percentage in saturation. Because now you take into account both molecule changes in relation to the oxygenated change. This is also recommended by quite a few authors, that this might be the best way of kind of creating robustness in your evaluation. Now, to close this off, just to do with the saturation value, is that there's a lot of terminology out there, and I think it creates to a certain degree some confusion that I don't like, at least in my understanding. And that is the term index and the term saturation, and then the term tissue and the term muscle. So if you have something that talks about tissue, for me that is generally a homogeneous model. So you just assume all tissue under your NIRS sensor is homogeneous, so you just measure it all the same. You don't care if it's fat or skin or muscle, it just gets pooled together into one tissue. If the term muscle is used, the device you're measuring should or has to make some effort to try to isolate the muscle layer. Won't do that perfectly, but there needs to be some kind of effort made in being like, this is only a muscle measure. So just on those two terms. Because if you're using them interchangeably, I think it's wrong. It creates confusion. And the second is this index or saturation. A saturation has to do with something being saturated, which has a minimum and a maximum value. That's why you're 0 to 100%, maximally saturated, minimally saturated. It's a scale it's limited in a maximum in value. Whereas index is really just a change of a variable, often to a fixed standard. Okay, that's why often you use them with non-quantifiable values, because it's just a change from a fixed standard. And those are not the same. So an index, you can use any number and it's just changing. It doesn't need to be on the 0 to 100% scale. But if you say it's a saturation, then you should somehow relate that to this. What is 100% saturated and what is 0% saturated? You need to bound that somehow to should be something reasonable, let's say physiologically for our terms. So that's also important, that a tissue oxygen index, which we often see, should not be the same as a muscle oxygenation saturation. Those terms are different and need to be applied differently. And they mean different things. So I think that's really important. And then to kind of bring that back together with, if you have a tissue oxygenation index or or a tissue oxygenation saturation or a muscle oxygenation saturation, those values should not end up being the same, okay, unless you have no other tissue than muscle, which in the human case is not the case. But the important difference is that if you are worried about thermoregulatory effects of blood flow in the skin, that should only be a worry in a tissue oxygen index, that you need to be like, I don't know, but in a muscle oxygenation saturation, that should be eliminated or mostly eliminated. So you shouldn't have to worry about that if it's being done correctly. So that's kind of my last point. Thank you very much. I hope that helped. And yeah, keep sending me some questions. Bye.